I went up the mountain because my mother did not want to be alone on New Year's anymore. My father had died the previous spring, sudden and quiet the way heart problems often are. After the funeral, she stopped staying anywhere overnight. She slept on the couch with the television on. She left lamps burning in empty rooms. She asked me to come up for holidays that used to be noisy and full. New Year's was the one she seemed to dread the most. Midnight reminded her too much of endings. The house sat at the end of a gravel road in eastern Kentucky, tucked into a narrow holler where the ridges pressed close on both sides. Trees leaned in over the road. The GPS stopped giving instructions a mile before the turn, as if the place had been erased. I knew the route from memory. 2 rusted mailboxes nailed to the same post. A bend that always flooded in spring. A stand of hemlocks that blocked the sky. I arrived just before dark. The air was sharp and clean. Wood smoke hung low and steady, the kind that settles instead of drifting. I helped her bring in firewood from the stack near the shed. The logs were heavy and damp. My hands smelled like bark and dirt. The house looked the same as it always had. Aluminum siding. One porch light that never worked right. The windows reflecting the slope of the mountain like dark mirrors. As we worked, I heard the first fireworks. One sharp crack, then nothing. A few minutes later, another. They were far off, across the ridge. No color showed through the trees. The sound did not roll or echo. It ended too clean. It felt early. I checked my phone. It was not even 6 yet. Fireworks happened out here sometimes. People shot them off whenever they felt like it. There were no town limits to worry about. Still, the timing felt off. They were spaced too far apart to be celebration. No cheering followed. No quick bursts. Just single concussions that made the air tighten and then relax. After we finished with the wood, I noticed the dogs down the hollow. Several families kept dogs loose on their properties. You could usually tell where someone was by which dog barked first. That night, the barking came in waves. One would start, another would answer, then another, farther off like a signal moving along the creek. It did not have the frantic edge of coyotes passing through. It had rhythm. Inside, the house was warm and dim. My mother kept the lights low. The television played a rerun with the volume barely up. She sat in her chair with a blanket over her legs. I could see how thin she had gotten. The house smelled like pine cleaner and would smoke. Everything felt tight, like it was holding its breath. I went outside a few times to check the sky. The moon was thin and sharp. Stars showed in clusters where the trees opened. Around 9, the fireworks started again. Closer now. Still single sounds. Still no echo. I felt them more than I heard them, a dull punch that traveled through the ground. The dogs responded each time, but not all at once. It moved like something passing through, setting them off as it went. By 11, the holler felt wrong. The air had gone still. Smoke no longer drifted. It hung in layers. The dogs barked in shorter bursts, then stopped, then started again. Each time, the pattern changed. I stood on the porch and listened. I could place most of the houses by sound. One near the creek, one higher up the slope, one far back where the road forked and ended. The barking did not match the usual order. At around 11:40, the fireworks started again. They were close enough that I could feel the vibration in my chest. Still no flashes. Still no echo. The sound was flat, like the hills were absorbing it instead of throwing it back. I counted 5, spaced out by several seconds each. After the last one, the dogs went wild. Every dog in the hollow barked at once, then staggered into that same moving pattern, like they were tracking something slow and deliberate. I felt a pressure behind my eyes. I had the urge to turn off the porch light. I did not like how visible the house felt. Midnight came without any countdown. The television was on mute. My phone showed 12 exactly. At that moment, the power went out. Not a flicker. Not a surge. Everything went dead at once. The television screen went black. The lamps cut off. The hum of the refrigerator stopped. The house fell into a darkness so complete it felt physical. At the same instant, every dog stopped barking. The silence landed hard. No wind. No insects. No distant traffic. Nothing. It felt like the hollow had been sealed. I stood still and listened. My heart beat loud enough that it embarrassed me. I waited for the dogs to start again. They did not. I waited for another sound, any sound. None came. The power outages out here usually took time. A branch hit a line. A transformer popped. There would be a noise, a delay, then the lights would go. This had been clean. Exact. I went to the window and looked out. The ridge was a solid wall of black. No house lights showed. No headlights. No glow at all. It was as if the entire holler had been switched off together. I thought about the fireworks. I thought about how they had no echo. I thought about how the dogs had tracked something that night. I thought about how they had all stopped at once, as if trained. I stayed by the window until my eyes adjusted. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted. The road was empty. After several minutes, the silence broke. It was faint at first. A low mechanical sound, steady and controlled. It came from up the road, higher on the mountain. It moved downhill. It was not a vehicle engine. It did not rev or idle. It sounded like equipment. The sound passed without stopping. As it moved, dogs began barking again, but not behind it. Ahead of it, they barked briefly, then went quiet as the sound reached them. The pattern moved away from the house, toward the creek, then faded. The power did not come back right away. We sat in the dark with a flashlight on the table. I stayed awake all night. Nothing else happened. The next morning, daylight returned the shape of the place. The mountain looked normal. The road showed tire tracks that had not been there the day before. They were deep and wide, not from a regular truck. They did not turn into any driveway. They continued down the road and vanished where the gravel met mud near the creek. Later that week, I asked around without being obvious. I learned that a crew had been working up the mountain, clearing land for an illegal dump site tied to a group that cooked meth in a mobile setup. They used fireworks to mask test shots when they cleared wildlife and targets. They cut power lines to avoid cameras and to keep anyone from calling out. The equipment sound had been a tracked vehicle hauling gear through the holler under cover of noise and darkness. The dogs had not been reacting to celebration. They had been reacting to movement. My mother sold the house the following spring. She moved closer to town, where the lights stayed on and sounds overlapped. I do not go up that road anymore. On New Year's Eve, I still think about how silence can be more precise than noise, and how some people choose midnight for reasons that have nothing to do with celebration. My car broke down just before the state line, the engine wheezing until it finally surrendered on the edge of the desert. The sun had already sunk behind the low hills, leaving the sky bruised and the highway empty. I'd been driving all day, the miles stretching behind me in a blur of asphalt and dry scrub, trying to make it home before midnight. The heat of the day had lingered in the metal of my car, but now the air was sharp, cold in a way that made my cheeks sting. I called for a tow, and the driver arrived 20 minutes later, his truck rattling down the empty road like it belonged to another time. He didn't speak much, just motioned for me to follow him, and I climbed in, watching the desert fade behind us under a sky that was almost black. The wind whipped against the cab as he drove, and the headlights traced the outlines of cacti and distant hills. The radio was dead, the silence pressing in around us, and the only sound was the engine and the occasional scrape of the tires against gravel as we turned onto a side road. We came to a small, one-story motel that looked as if it had been there since the 50s and never touched again. The paint was faded, peeling, and the neon sign above the entrance flickered once before sputtering out. The parking lot was cracked, weeds growing through the asphalt, and a thin layer of dust coated the windows. The tow driver stopped in front of the office, and I followed him inside. It smelled of old carpet, cleaner that had long since dried, and something faintly sour, like wet fabric left in the sun too long. The lobby was nearly empty except for a single counter and a chair pushed against the wall. Behind the counter, a man sat reading a newspaper. He was older, his face lined and sunburned, and he didn't look up when we came in. I explained the situation, mentioned that it was New Year's Eve and that I wasn't sure how long I'd need to stay. He didn't look at me. He just slid a key across the counter, a plain metal key with a small tag, and gestured toward the hallway. I noticed the calendar on the wall had no dates marked, only a single faded photograph of the motel from decades ago. I tried again, mentioning New Year's, the idea of midnight, a celebration, anything that would suggest the outside world mattered here. His eyes flicked up briefly, then back down at the paper, like he didn't recognize the words. I didn't push it. I had no other choice but to take the room. The room itself smelled faintly of smoke and dust, the carpet frayed at the edges, the sheets thin and worn. The window looked out over the empty lot and the desert beyond, and I could see the highway stretching into the darkness, a ribbon that led nowhere. I set my bag down, unplugged the heater to make room for a small lamp I had brought, and turned it on. The glow revealed cracks in the plaster, stains along the ceiling, and a thin layer of grit on the furniture. I tried to distract myself by taking a shower, but the water sputtered and came out uneven, hot and cold in patches. The sound of it against the metal tub was sharp in the small space. By 11:30, I had dressed in the same clothes I'd been wearing all day, feeling the ache in my shoulders from hours of driving. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The desert was quiet, the wind had calmed, and the silence outside the window was complete. I checked my watch, and it read 11:55. The room felt colder suddenly, the shadows lengthening as the last minutes of the year ticked away. Then it happened. Every light in the motel went out at once. The lamps in the hallway, the neon outside, the dim glow of other rooms, all gone. Mine was the only room still lit, the small lamp casting a warm circle against the faded wallpaper. I noticed then the sounds from the other rooms. It was subtle at first. Breathing. Not my own, not the wind, but human breathing. Slow, measured, perfectly in sync. There was no movement, no shuffling of feet, nothing that indicated anyone was awake or moving, just the steady rhythm of inhaling and exhaling through walls. I counted my own breaths to match them, trying to convince myself it was my imagination, but the timing was exact. It didn't shift, didn't falter. The uniformity was unnerving, as if the entire motel had synchronized without anyone speaking or planning. I felt a tension in my chest, a weight that made it hard to move. I wanted to leave, to open the door and run into the empty lot, but the hallway beyond was pitch black. I could feel the thin carpet under my hand as I gripped the edge of the bed, every nerve in my body alert. The clock ticked on. 11:58, 11:59. My heart had started to pound, every beat loud in my ears. I couldn't see the other rooms, but I could feel them, the presence of bodies waiting behind walls, holding still. At exactly midnight, I expected something, bells, cheers, fireworks, but there was nothing. The silence continued, broken only by the breathing. I felt my chest tighten, and the lamp in my room flickered slightly, as if it too were holding its breath. 1 minute passed, then another. 12:01. The synchronized breathing snapped like a rubber band, every sound of it vanishing at once. I was left with my own ragged inhale and the soft hum of the heater, and the motel returned to the same emptiness it had had before. I lay back on the bed, the room feeling impossibly large and hollow, and listened. The desert outside was quiet. The parking lot was still. There was no neon, no other lights, no sound of celebration, no voices, no cars. The other rooms were silent, dead silent, and I realized the motel didn't acknowledge the world outside. It had its own rules, its own rhythm. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, noting every crack, every stain, every corner of the room. I couldn't sleep. Even when exhaustion finally claimed me, it was restless, shallow, filled with half-dreams of waiting rooms, empty highways, and synchronized breathing. Morning came in a slow wash of pale light. I opened the curtains and saw the desert stretching beyond the lot, endless and indifferent. The motel was quiet, as though nothing had happened. I packed my things, paid the clerk without a word, and stepped out into the sun. The air was already hot, and the highway shimmered in the distance. I walked past the cracked asphalt and weeds, the neon sign still dead, and felt the weight of the night pressing on me. The motel had offered no celebration, no recognition, no welcome. It had only waited, a silent witness, indifferent to time, to the outside world, to New Year's. I started my car, the engine turning over with a rasp, and drove away, leaving the empty lot and the single-story building behind. Even now, decades later, I can feel the memory of that breathing, perfectly timed and utterly alien, and I know I will never see a new year the same way again. The experience wasn't supernatural. It was the world reduced to its simplest, coldest form. A place that existed entirely on its own terms. A reminder that sometimes, the passage of time doesn't matter, and sometimes the people around you, even when you can hear them, might as well not exist. I drove on through the desert, the miles stretching endlessly, the sun climbing higher, and I realized the horror of that night wasn't the dark or the silence, but the absence of recognition, the indifference of a place that refused to mark the turning of the year. It was a lesson in stillness and observation, in being utterly alone even when surrounded by others. By the time I reached the state line, the sky was bright and clear, and the world had moved on, leaving me with nothing but memory and the slow realization that some places are alive only in their own way, never in ours. It was just past midnight when we drove into the old quarry outside Phoenix. The road had narrowed into a rough, uneven track that ended in a flat clearing, jagged rock walls rising around us. Someone at work had mentioned a secret New Year's thing in passing, and we, a group of 6 co-workers, decided it sounded adventurous. None of us knew the details, only that it was supposed to be unconventional, private, maybe a little wild. I expected a small party, a fire, maybe a few strangers, drinks, laughter. I did not expect what we found. The quarry itself was dark and cold. The walls rose like cliffs in the faint glow of our headlights, and the flat area at the bottom was scattered with cars, parked in perfect lines. They all faced outward, toward the rough exit, like someone had planned it for a fast departure. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't festive. It was deliberate. My friends laughed nervously as we parked between 2 black SUVs. But even in that lightheartedness, there was tension. The wind carried the faint scrape of loose rock, the smell of damp earth, and a silence that felt like a pause held too long. I realized I had no idea how many people were here. Shadows moved, but there were no voices, no music, no sound beyond the occasional crackle of small fires. People were scattered around, standing alone or in small, sparse groups, near fires that barely cut through the darkness. They didn't speak. They didn't move toward each other. They just stood, faces dimly lit by orange flames, looking out at nothing or each other, waiting. I tried to make sense of it, imagining some kind of ritual, a countdown we weren't part of yet. We wandered toward one of the fires, not wanting to be the first to stand completely alone. The fire was low, smoke twisting up and curling against the cliffs. The heat was faint, but it carried the smell of dry wood and something slightly metallic, maybe just the stone around us heating. I felt exposed, the only sound being the gravel crunching under our shoes as we moved. Every car's engine had long died, every person frozen in place, and I realized no one had acknowledged us. No smiles, no nods. Just silence. I tried to focus on something familiar. My friends were near me, moving together like a small group of deer in the brush. We weren't talking. The air was heavier than the desert night should have been, still but carrying a strange, weightless tension. My chest felt tight. I looked around. There were at least 30 people, maybe more, standing with their backs straight, faces blank. I tried to count them, but my eyes kept catching new shadows. People at the edges of the firelight, standing like statues. I thought I saw a movement, someone turning, then another figure moving in sync, and I froze. That's when the clock started striking midnight somewhere behind the cliffs. There was no countdown from the people, no cheers, no celebration. The hour passed with only the distant echo of the town's faint bells, somewhere out of sight. At midnight, every single person turned toward us at once. Not slowly, not individually. They all shifted, a single movement, as though we had crossed an invisible line. It wasn't angry. It wasn't curious. It was a tension that felt almost physical, like a weight pressing against my shoulders. Every flame illuminated faces that didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't breathe audibly. I had never felt anything like it. My stomach flipped, my throat tightened. My friends froze too. The air felt colder, the night sharper, and I understood we were completely out of our depth. We left immediately. No words, just a tight, hurried retreat toward our car. Gravel skittered under tires, small sparks rising from rocks underfoot, but no one followed. The rows of vehicles watched us leave in the flickering firelight. I didn't look back. The weight on my shoulders stayed until the car doors slammed, and we were inside, engine running. We didn't speak until we were well down the track, headlights cutting through the night. Then it was nervous laughter, shallow, trembling, like we had all breathed the same held breath for too long. The drive back was slow, careful, as if speed would summon something we couldn't define. Every turn, every shadow in the desert looked like another person standing, waiting. The quarry disappeared behind the cliffs, the sky above us empty and vast. The air in the car was warm but heavy. We didn't stop to discuss what we'd seen. Every glance toward each other was a silent question. Did anyone else feel it? Everyone nodded, and that was enough. The unspoken agreement was to never mention it again. The next morning, in the light of day, we tried to reconcile what had happened. Over coffee, over cigarettes, over long glances at each other's faces, we couldn't agree on how many people had been there. Some said 30, some claimed 50. One person swore it had been less than 20. The descriptions didn't match. Some said they had seen faces pressed against car windows. Others swore every fire had at least 2 people around it. We all remembered the turn at midnight, the movement, the attention. The rest blurred, but the feeling of being watched stayed. We each tried to explain it rationally. Maybe it was some underground event, some strange New Year's tradition that had no purpose but observation. Maybe everyone was part of a performance, a private ritual. The detail that no one had talked, no music had played, no lights had flared, it was consistent. I thought about reporting it to someone, the police, the city, an online forum, but the moment seemed so fragile, so personal, it would dissolve under scrutiny. Weeks passed, and the memory lingered like a bruise. I couldn't stop thinking about the turn, the alignment of bodies, the stillness that preceded it. I avoided passing that stretch of desert when I could, but every time I did, I felt it again. The sense of an unseen crowd, the way the world tilts slightly when expectation meets unknown. My friends moved on, returned to their lives, but for me, it had broken a quiet assumption that when people gather for celebration, the world will follow familiar rules. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you can walk into what looks like a party and realize you are the only strangers in a precise, deliberate, silent assembly. We never went back. We never found out what that gathering was, or if it happened again. Over time, the memory sharpened, not softened. I remembered every crack of rock underfoot, the smell of wood and earth, the exact placement of each fire. I remembered the way the air seemed to press down at midnight, the collective movement toward us that made me want to run before we even understood why. That night became a reference point, a boundary between normal life and the unexpected, and it never lost its hold. Even now, years later, the image of that quarry in darkness comes to mind on New Year's Eve. The silence, the fires, the cars facing outward, the turn at midnight. I can close my eyes and see it exactly as it happened. I can feel the press of attention, the unnatural stillness of the crowd, the way the moment lingered longer than the hour. We went thinking it was a party. It was not. It was something else, something careful, deliberate, and completely indifferent to us, and we were allowed to leave only because we were seen. The memory of that night is perfectly intact, unsoftened by time, and it reminds me that some gatherings are never meant to include outsiders, no matter how simple the invitation seems. December 31st, 2020, 1 a.m. The mall had been a hollow shell for months. Stores were dark, their windows plastered with closed indefinitely signs. The few lights that remained flickered intermittently, mostly near entrances and along the main corridors. I was the last one left on the floor, tasked with locking everything up and walking the building to make sure nothing had been left behind. COVID had turned this place into a ghost town, but management still insisted on nightly security checks, even if the only real threat was someone wandering in out of boredom. I walked slowly, shoes squeaking slightly on the polished tile. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with something older, something that clung to carpet and fabric and the faint residue of food courts that hadn't seen customers in months. The escalators were frozen in place, a frozen image of movement that added to the stillness. Even my own footsteps felt loud, echoing against the empty storefronts. I started my usual routine, checking the main corridors, then moving into the side halls that led to service entrances and back rooms. I flicked the emergency lights on and off as I passed, making sure everything was functional, checking that doors latched properly. The cameras showed empty corridors, empty halls, and empty stores. Every movement on the monitors felt exaggerated, because there was nothing else to see. When I reached the food court, I noticed a strange sharpness in the silence, like it had weight. The metal chairs were still stacked, the paper trash long since removed by the earlier skeleton crew. I was about to move past the area when I heard it, a slow, deliberate clap. It bounced off the walls in uneven echoes, one hand clapping into the hard surfaces of the food court. I froze, expecting some maintenance crew, someone I hadn't noticed. Nothing. I checked the cameras mounted above the seating area. Empty. I walked a few steps toward the source of the sound, half expecting to catch someone messing around, and the clapping stopped. My own footsteps sounded deafening in comparison, and after a moment of hesitation, I moved on toward the west wing, where fewer cameras were installed. That's when it started again. One slow, measured clap. I froze instinctively and looked around. Nothing moved. The cameras showed nothing. I told myself it was the building settling, a pipe shifting, or some leftover decoration scraping against a light fixture. It made sense, but the sound came again as I passed the empty corridor leading to the bathrooms. Clap. Clap. The sound was ahead of me now, faint but deliberate, as though it anticipated where I was going. I quickened my pace slightly, trying to reach the main entrance doors where I could finally leave. Every time I paused, it paused. Every time I moved, it moved just a few steps ahead, always staying out of reach, never visible on the cameras. The overhead lights flickered as I passed, throwing shadows into the corners, making everything feel longer and darker than it was. I kept glancing at the monitors, scanning for movement. Nothing. The janitor's closets were all locked, the office doors were bolted. The sound didn't seem to have a source I could trace. I started running my hand along the walls, trying to feel for drafts, for air currents, for something physical. Nothing. I entered the main atrium, where the ceiling was high and the space echoed everything. The clapping became intermittent, far enough ahead to make me tense, but close enough to make it impossible to ignore. I started checking under tables and behind columns. The tiles were dusty, footprints rare, and scattered from maintenance earlier in the evening. I pressed my ear to a metal chair, expecting it to rattle or vibrate. Nothing. Finally, I reached the security desk. My chair was empty, as it should have been. I leaned against the counter to catch my breath. The building felt heavier, like the air itself was more dense when no one else was around. That's when I noticed the footprints. Dust-covered, faint, leading from the far end of the atrium straight to the desk. They stopped inches from where I was leaning. I traced them with my eyes, counting the steps, trying to see if they were recent. They were. The dust hadn't had time to settle again. The pattern of the prints made no sense. They were human, adult-sized, but they didn't correspond with any route I had taken. They didn't cross any doorways or pass through any barriers. They simply appeared and stopped just short of me. I stepped back and checked the corridor again, running my flashlight over every corner. Nothing. The sound had stopped entirely, but the feeling remained, the tightness in my chest, the way the quiet pressed in on me. I remembered the doors I had locked earlier and retraced my steps in my mind. Every single exit was secured. No one could have entered without making noise, without setting off an alarm. And yet, those footprints existed. I walked around the desk slowly, crouching to examine them. The dust was fine, the pattern deep enough to suggest weight. Whoever or whatever had left them had been deliberate, careful, intentional. My pulse thumped in my ears, each beat loud enough to drown out the rest of the silence. I retraced the prints back toward the food court, shining my flashlight on every inch of tile. There was nothing. No chair moved, no trash disturbed, nothing that could explain them. I decided it was time to leave. I checked the mall entrance one last time, making sure the locks were engaged, then swung the door open. The cold winter air hit my face, bitter and sharp after the stale warmth of the building. I paused, staring back at the mall, empty and dark. The feeling of being watched had faded, but the footprint memory stayed. I shut the door behind me, engaged the deadbolt, and walked back to my car. The streets were empty. Snow had started falling lightly, coating the asphalt in a thin, silent layer. I drove slowly, thinking about the prints, about the sound that had seemed to track me. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking. I inspected my shoes and uniform, looking for signs of someone else, anything out of place. Nothing. Everything was normal. I never saw anyone, never found an explanation. The mall stayed empty for months, and the next night I returned for my shift, the building silent and unchanged. I walked past the food court and noticed the dust had settled. No footprints. No signs of disturbance. Everything looked like it had always looked. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a prank or a hallucination. I've worked in security long enough to know the difference. It was human. Someone had been there or had left evidence as though they had been. The deliberate clapping, the careful placement of the prints, the way they stopped just short of me. It was intentional, meant to be noticed, meant to unsettle. I never returned to that shift alone. I asked for a partner, even when it wasn't required. The mall eventually closed permanently. When I think about that night, I imagine someone moving silently through an empty building, leaving traces just to remind you they had been there. The footprints, the sound, the stillness, all of it stays in my memory because it was so simple, so real, and yet so unexplainable. I locked the doors behind me that night and left, but I never truly left the feeling that someone had been there with me, watching, careful not to be caught. It was late December, the year ending, when we drove up into the Upper Peninsula. The roads were narrow, snow-packed, and mostly empty. We had four-wheel drive, but it barely mattered. The forest pressed close on either side, dark pine and birch branches bowing under heavy snow. The GPS led us down what looked like a service road, gravel and ice, until we reached the cabin. From the outside it was small, wooden, with paint peeling and a sagging porch. The snow was deep, and no other lights shone through the trees. We unloaded, carrying bags and a bottle of cheap champagne. The heater inside worked, though inconsistently. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp pine, and the floorboards creaked under every step. The listing had warned it was rustic. That turned out to be true. The walls were thin, the windows rattled with wind, and the plumbing sputtered when we ran water. We thought it added character. No neighbors, no cell service, total isolation. Half the price of other cabins in the area. That had sold us. We settled in, stacked firewood, poured drinks, and watched the snow pile against the windows. Outside, the forest was still, almost reverent, broken only by the occasional gust that shook snow off branches. As midnight approached, we decided to celebrate outside. We bundled up in coats, hats, and scarves, carrying sparklers into the snow. The cold hit sharply, making breath visible in the air. We set off the sparklers, watching light flicker over the trees, and shouted over the quiet, the words barely reaching the treeline. The snow glittered under the sparks, and the cabin looked smaller against the dark, towering woods. Then we noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they were from a deer or a large dog, but the prints were too long, too deliberate. They circled the cabin, starting at no obvious point, just appearing in the fresh snow. They didn't come from the woods, and didn't lead back into them. They curved around as if someone or something was studying the cabin, taking time, pacing, and then stopped. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, nothing to suggest someone had been hiding in the forest. But the tracks were there, exact in the snow, visible under the thin light from the cabin. I remember staring at them, feeling a hollow awareness settle in my chest. My friends noticed too, but we stayed outside until the sparklers burned out. The cold became sharper, the wind heavier. We went back inside, shutting the door firmly, pushing snow against the bottom to seal it. I lay awake for a while, listening to the cabin shift under the wind. The heater popped, the floor creaked, snow slid off the roof. My mind returned to those tracks. Whoever, or whatever, had left them was still close. The thought wasn't entertaining, it was deliberate. By the time I fell asleep, I kept the window closed, locked the door, and stayed aware of every sound. Morning came slowly, pale and gray. I stepped outside first, boots crunching the crusted snow. My friends followed. The tracks were gone. The snow was untouched, like the cabin had been alone all night. I checked carefully, following where the prints had been, expecting them to appear further down the drive, in the trees, but the snow was clean. Not a hint of them beyond a few scattered flakes. My friends shrugged, called it a dream or too much champagne. I didn't mention the deep impression I had noticed beneath my bedroom window, a single indentation, heavy, as if someone had stood there long enough to press into the snow and leave it raw. We spent the day clearing paths to the woodpile, stacking more firewood, keeping the fire going, trying to shake the unease. The forest stayed quiet, the sky low and gray, snow falling lightly through the afternoon. I watched the treeline constantly, feeling like we were being watched, even though everything suggested nothing was there. The cabin felt smaller, tighter. Every creak of wood made my stomach twist. That evening, we lit the fireplace again, drank the remaining champagne, and tried to laugh. The cold outside pressed harder now, and we layered coats and blankets, settling near the fire. The snow outside thickened, the cabin fading into a mound of white. We didn't go outside. The quiet felt deliberate. Even in the warmth of the fire, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against the cabin walls. At night, I slept lightly. Every sound made me wake. Wind brushing the trees, snow sliding off the roof, a floorboard groaning under the weight of frost, or the structure settling. I checked the window frequently. The deep indentation remained visible, frozen, a clear mark that no one had moved or disturbed it. Whoever had been there hadn't returned, but the presence felt immediate, like a lingering shadow. I couldn't place it. It wasn't human, wasn't wild, just deliberate. A weight in the world that didn't belong. By the next morning, the snow had shifted, the mark almost obscured, but my mind held it in sharp focus. The cabin itself had changed for me. No longer just a cheap getaway, it felt contained, watched. The isolation was no longer charming. It pressed in. We packed up, moving quickly, boots crunching deep snow, bags heavy. Driving away, the cabin shrank into the distance, swallowed by gray trees and falling snow. We didn't speak much, all aware of what we had seen, what we had felt. The tracks weren't explained, no logical answer presented itself. The forest gave nothing back. Weeks later, I returned in memory to that cabin when I thought of quiet, isolation, the weight of being alone with a deliberate presence. The snow, the tracks, the deep impression, they were real, exact, tangible. No exaggeration, no memory tricks. Just an explanation that fit no normal scenario. A cheap cabin, no neighbors, no service, a place that seemed like a deal. Cheaper for a reason. The reason wasn't hidden pipes or poor heating. It was the unseen weight of being watched, a deliberate presence that could step close, leave its mark, and vanish into nothing. I never went back. I never wanted to. The snow melted, the tracks disappeared entirely, the forest returned to normal, and the imprint under my window faded. But I carried the memory, the way it made everything feel smaller, heavier. I realized later the price wasn't in dollars. It was in the quiet knowledge that some places are cheap because the world around them is real, deliberate, and indifferent in a way that nothing can erase. The cabin was cheap for a reason, and the reason had nothing to do with comfort or amenities. It was the forest itself, the isolation, and something deliberate in the night that left a mark in the snow and stayed with me long after we left. I was driving alone on the night of December 31st, 1993, somewhere that doesn't need a name, somewhere that could be anywhere in the stretches of empty roads and small towns you pass through on the way to somewhere else. The streets were dark, and the sky was the kind of black that made everything else seem quieter. The car's headlights cut through the night, long beams over the frost-lined asphalt, illuminating nothing but more road ahead. I had been driving for hours, avoiding towns that smelled of burnt fireworks and cheap beer, trying to get away from the crowds that didn't matter to me. I wanted to be alone for the countdown, or at least what I thought would be a normal countdown, something simple that marked the end of a year and the beginning of the next. I had the radio on, flipping through stations, looking for something familiar. Every station was wrong. Some were ahead, some were behind. The voices were flat, the music out of sync with the hour, and the jingles that were supposed to signal midnight had either already happened or hadn't arrived yet. The more I flipped, the more tense I felt, though it wasn't exactly fear, just a quiet unease, a feeling that nothing was lining up the way it should. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, not from cold, though the frost on the windshield made my fingers ache, but from the growing realization that the night wasn't matching anything I knew. Then, at 12:07, one local AM station started again, counting down from 10. The voice was calm, monotone, not hurried, not excited. There was no music, no cheering, no hosts. Just the numbers. 10, 9, 8. I eased the car onto the shoulder and stopped. I wasn't sure why exactly. I just needed to be still when the world outside was no longer following the rules I expected. 7, 6, 5. The engine hummed faintly, a low vibration through the frame of the car, and I realized how loud the silence had become outside. 4, 3. The numbers felt heavier each time, as if they weren't just counting down seconds, but something else entirely. 2, 1, 0. The radio cut out completely. The engine died immediately, without warning. The lights went dark. The warmth in the cabin vanished almost instantly, leaving me exposed to the cold that had been just outside before. I tried to turn the key again. Nothing. The dash was dead. The car had become nothing more than a dark box on the side of the road. I was alone, the blackness beyond the windshield complete except for the yellow stripes that marked the empty road ahead. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, just barely distinguishable, like someone was speaking through a thick wall of snow or wind. Slow, deliberate counting. 10, 9, 8. Not the radio, not any human I could see, but coming from somewhere close enough that I didn't think it could be far away. Each number was drawn out, uneven, almost as if the voice was learning the words as it spoke them. 7, 6, 5. I pressed my hands to the wheel, trying to make sense of the sound, trying to locate it, but the darkness swallowed everything. 4, 3. The numbers were off rhythm from the radio's countdown, off in a way that made my chest tighten. 2, 1, 0. I opened the door carefully, the cold stabbing my skin instantly. I stepped out, boots crunching on frozen gravel, ears straining. The night was still, too still. The sound came again, this time from a different angle, further away, but the same slow, methodical counting. 10, 9, 8. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a car alarm somewhere, a prankster, someone drunk who thought it was funny to repeat the countdown. But nothing matched. The roads were empty. No distant headlights. No buildings with open windows. No towns. Just me and the counting, slow and careful, as if it was mimicking a sequence it didn't fully understand. I went back to the car and sat, listening. The frost from my breath collected on the glass, leaving patterns I couldn't see past. The numbers continued, scattered across the darkness, disjointed and deliberate. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but the cell phone I had wasn't worth the plastic it was made from. Coverage was dead. The car couldn't start. I realized I hadn't seen another person for miles, hadn't passed a single living soul since I left the highway hours ago. The world had narrowed to the two things I could hear: the faint echo of my own thoughts and the slow, deliberate counting that came from nowhere I could identify. Time became difficult to measure. My watch said one thing: the radio was gone, the world around me silent except for the counting. I tried to reason with myself, tried to convince myself it was some trick of the night, that maybe another car had stopped far away and the numbers were distorted by the frost and the dark. But even that seemed unlikely. Every sound was unnaturally precise. 10, 9, 8. Pause. 7, 6, 5. Pause. 2, 1, 0. Each repetition took longer than it should have, stretching into a kind of patience I didn't feel I had. Eventually I decided to walk. The road underfoot was hard and cold, the frost biting through my boots. I kept moving slowly, listening. The counting moved with me, always in the distance, but always precise. I tried not to panic, tried to keep my steps measured, focused on each one, but my hands shook despite the layers of clothes I wore. The numbers didn't change tone. They didn't waver. They didn't hurry or slow except in that strange, almost experimental way, like someone or something was testing the pace of speech. After what felt like an hour, a faint light appeared ahead. A gas station closed, its pumps frozen in place, signs yellowed from winter. I approached carefully, listening. The counting stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had been repeating it had reached a boundary it could not cross. The cold felt less biting under the dim light, but my heart still raced. I fumbled with the door handle, realizing my keys were still in the car. I went back and retrieved them, trying the ignition again. The engine turned over, without complaint this time. I stayed in the car a long while, idling, not ready to move until the night made sense again. The counting didn't return. The radio was dead, the other stations still off, but at least the silence was just silence, not that measured, impossible voice. I thought about what had happened, and I didn't have an answer, only a memory of numbers drawn slowly out of the dark. I drove carefully back toward the highway, toward lights and people, and the predictable chaos of a new year beginning. By the time I reached the first real town, the sky was lightening just a touch. The frost was gone from the asphalt. The streets had movement again, cars heading home or to friends. I parked at a diner and sat inside with coffee until the world felt right again. I never saw anyone else on that stretch of road that night, never heard the counting again, and I never found an explanation. Whatever it had been, it was gone. The next day, the radio was normal. Every station had New Year's music, hosts laughing, fireworks in the background. People spoke as if nothing had been wrong. I tried to tell myself it was a glitch, a delay in broadcasting, but I knew what I had heard. The slow, deliberate numbers. The pause, the stretch, the impossible imitation. I never drove that road again after midnight. I never needed to. The memory was enough. The world, I realized, can shift for a brief stretch without notice, and for one night, it did. My name is Mark H., and I was driving west on Route 50 to save money. It was New Year's Eve, but that did not matter to me. I had just finished a seasonal job and wanted to be back in California without paying for a motel. Overnight driving meant fewer cars, fewer distractions, and cheaper gas if I needed it. I left Ely after midnight with a full tank, a thermos of weak coffee, and the radio turned off. I wanted the road quiet. Route 50 at night feels unfinished. The pavement stretches forward, narrow and pale, with no towns for long distances. The land presses flat in some places and rises into low dark shapes in others. Snow still clung to the ground in shaded areas, but the road itself was dry. The sky was clear. The moon sat low and sharp, bright enough to outline the hills, but not enough to make the desert friendly. There were no fireworks, no distant parties, just black space and the steady sound of tires. I watched mile markers without thinking about them. That road trains you to do that. They become proof that you are moving. Around 1:15 a.m., one of them caught my attention because it looked damaged. The metal post leaned slightly, and the white sign had several bullet holes punched clean through it. The reflective tape along the edge had peeled loose, and hung in a thin strip that fluttered when my headlights passed. I noticed it because the tape flashed unevenly like it hesitated. A few minutes later, I saw the same marker again. I did not believe it at first. I assumed I had misread the number. I told myself the holes were common out there. People shoot signs. Still, the angle of the post and the way the tape hung were identical. I slowed down and checked the number as I passed. It was the same. I checked the odometer. It had moved. The road ahead looked the same as it always did, empty and straight. I kept driving for another mile, then pulled onto the gravel shoulder. I needed to reset myself. I blamed fatigue. I had been awake since the previous morning. I turned the engine off and stepped out into the cold. The air smelled clean and dry. No wind. No movement. My headlights lit the shoulder in a wide cone. I stood there for a moment, listening. The silence was deep. I did not hear another vehicle. I did not hear animals. I did not hear anything that suggested I was not alone. When I walked around the front of the car, I saw the footprints. They ran along the shoulder parallel to the road, starting a few yards behind my rear bumper and continuing forward into the dark. They were pressed deep into the gravel, heavier than I would expect. Each print showed a clear heel and long toes. There were no shoe marks. No tread. Bare skin. The size was wrong. They were too long and too wide to belong to most people. The stride was steady and even not rushed. Those prints had not been there when I pulled over earlier to stretch outside Ely. I knew that because I had stood in that same spot to pour coffee. I would have seen them. The gravel then had been smooth except for tire marks. I crouched and touched one of the impressions. The gravel was cold. The edges were sharp. The print was fresh. I looked up and scanned the road. The shoulder stretched empty in both directions. The desert beyond the beam of my headlights swallowed everything. I felt exposed standing there, like the light made me visible but did not give me control. I got back in the car and locked the doors. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road without checking anything else. I told myself the prints belonged to someone who had walked there earlier and that I had simply missed them. I told myself my mind was filling gaps because I was tired. I drove faster. After a few minutes, I noticed movement at the edge of my vision. Not in the road. Not in the ditch. Just beyond the reach of my headlights, where the light faded into gray. Something kept pace with the car. It did not cross into the beam. It stayed just outside it, matching my speed. At first, I thought it was an illusion caused by the rhythm of the road. I focused on the center line. The movement continued. When I sped up, it sped up. When I eased off, it stayed even. I adjusted the mirrors. Nothing behind me. I rolled the window down an inch to listen. The air rushed in. I heard my own engine. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear another motor. The sense of being tracked settled in slowly. It did not feel sudden or dramatic. It felt patient. Whatever it was understood the boundary of the light. It knew where the beam ended and did not cross it. For the next 40 miles, I drove with that awareness. The road bent gently through open land. The terrain changed from flat desert to low hills and back again. Each time the headlights swept a curve, the movement stayed just beyond reach, always on the passenger side. Sometimes it rose slightly, sometimes it dipped, as if following the same ground I was. I did not stop again. I did not turn the radio on. I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes forward. I checked the fuel gauge too often. I counted mile markers to make sure they were not repeating. Eventually, I began to notice another detail. Every so often, when the road ran close to a shallow wash or a service track, the movement grew more defined. Not a shape, but a mass. Something tall. Something upright. It never separated from the darkness enough to show features. It never reflected light. It behaved like someone who knew exactly how to stay hidden. The explanation came to me in pieces, not all at once. Route 50 runs alongside old maintenance roads and unmarked dirt tracks for long stretches. Some of them run parallel for miles. In daylight, you can see them clearly. At night, they vanish unless your headlights hit them directly. Someone could walk those tracks and stay level with the road. Someone used to the area would know where the ground stayed firm and where it dipped. Someone tall with a long stride could keep pace for a while, especially if the car was not going fast. Bare feet would explain the lack of shoe marks. It would also explain the deep prints. Skin presses differently than rubber. The thought that settled hardest was that the person had approached my car while I was stopped. The footprints began behind my bumper. That meant they had been close. Close enough to touch the trunk. Close enough to see inside if they wanted. I understood then why I had passed the same mile marker twice. I had not looped back. I had slowed without realizing it while my attention wandered. Someone on foot had gained ground during that moment. As I pushed closer to Fallon, traffic increased slightly. A pair of headlights appeared far ahead, then another behind me. The movement at the edge of the beam faded. When I passed a long straight stretch with clear shoulders and visible ground, there was nothing there. I did not feel relief. I felt delayed fear, the kind that waits until the danger has passed to arrive fully formed. My hands shook when I finally stopped for gas outside Fallon. In the bright lights of the station, everything looked ordinary. Cars, pumps, concrete. I checked the side of my car. Dust streaked the passenger side panel at about shoulder height, as if someone had brushed past it while moving alongside. The mark was faint, easy to miss. I would have missed it if I had not been looking. I finished the drive to California without stopping again. I did not celebrate the new year. I did not tell anyone the full story. Even now, years later, I do not drive that stretch at night if I can avoid it. Not because I believe in anything unreal, but because I understand how little space there is between light and dark out there, and how easily someone who knows the land can live in that narrow gap. January 1st, 2011, just after midnight. My brother and I had been drinking since early evening, enough to loosen our nerves, but not enough to make us stupid. The bush outside our cabin in northern Alberta was silent when we left. The snow had fallen in thick layers the day before, fresh powder that muffled the world and coated the trails in white. The plan was simple: take the snowmobiles out after midnight, enjoy the empty trails, and burn off some of the restless energy from the New Year's celebration. We were laughing quietly to ourselves when we loaded up, the engines roaring to life and startling the quiet around us. The air smelled cold and sharp, biting at any exposed skin. The forest was dense, trees packed closely together, their branches weighed down with snow. In the moonlight, the snow reflected pale, casting long shadows that shifted as the machines moved. At first, it felt like freedom. The trails were open, untouched, and silent except for the hum of the engines and the crunch of snow beneath the skis. We weren't fast, but the sleds carried us with a smooth power that made the cold fade from our fingers and faces. My brother took the lead, carving the trail, and I followed, keeping just behind him. After some time, the quiet started to feel heavier. Not a single sound besides the engines. No wind rustling the branches, no distant lights of other cabins or vehicles. Just the snow and the dark trees stretching endlessly. At first, it was peaceful, but gradually it pressed in on me. The silence was too complete, too clean, as if the forest had stopped for something. I glanced at my brother, thinking he might be feeling it too. He was riding straight, hands tight on the grips, shoulders tense under the reflective suit. We were approaching a curve in the trail when both sleds sputtered and stalled at the same time. The engines cut off suddenly, leaving only the soft hiss of the cold air and the distant crack of snow settling under the trees. My brother cursed under his breath and tried to restart his machine. I did the same, heart picking up speed more from the sudden quiet than from the failed engines. The snow around us was deep, and each movement felt heavier. The smell of exhaust lingered faintly, but it wasn't enough to mask the overwhelming stillness. Then we noticed something: movement in the trees. Not far off, just at the edge of the trail, a rhythm of weight shifting and breaking through snow. Branches snapped, but no shapes appeared. The sound followed us when we tried to restart the machines, pacing us as if keeping time with our own movement. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every time I looked, nothing. Nothing but dark shapes, shadows blending with the trunks. My stomach tightened. I didn't speak. There was no one else there. I knew that. It had to be an animal, I told myself. A wolf or a moose, maybe a lynx. None of them moved like this, not matching our speed, not pacing us when we started moving again. Eventually, the engines roared back to life. The sleds vibrated under us as we took off slowly, cautious now. The sound behind us grew clearer, heavier, as though the snow itself was being forced aside. We were careful to stay on the main trail, staying in sight of each other, but the feeling didn't leave. Something was keeping up with us, step for step, just beyond the tree line, careful to stay hidden but deliberate in its movement. My hands were tight on the grips, knuckles white, and I kept imagining shapes in the shadows, things that couldn't exist. The snow was churned up beside the trail, deep impressions that didn't match anything we had seen before. We pushed on, the quiet now broken by the roar of engines and our own racing thoughts. The forest seemed endless, dark and heavy. Each time I slowed to look over my shoulder, the movement stopped, perfectly timed. My brother didn't glance back once, just focused on the trail, but I could tell from the set of his shoulders that he felt it too. The snow under the machine started to change, showing tracks beside the trail. At first, I thought they were just ours, half covered by the wind, but then I counted. 3 sets of tracks followed us, evenly spaced, precise, as if someone had been walking right behind us for miles without us noticing. The realization hit me slowly, a cold wave under my skin. 3 sets. Not 1. Not 2. 3. We didn't speak. There was no point. The trail narrowed, forcing the sleds through tight corners where branches scratched helmets and shoulders. Each turn, each drop in elevation, made the forest feel more oppressive, more deliberate. The tracks stayed with us, keeping pace, merging with the soft drift of snow that our machines threw off. The sound had gone silent again, but the presence lingered, a pressure at the edge of hearing, in the spaces the headlights didn't reach. My mind searched for explanations. Hunters? Trespassers? Some local out on New Year's? None of it made sense. Anyone out there would have to be moving through waist-deep snow to keep pace, without skis, without sound. It was impossible, and yet I knew what I had seen in the snow. Finally, we broke the tree line. The trail opened into a wide clearing where the moonlight reflected off untouched snow. The sudden openness made my heart thump painfully in my chest. I stopped, letting the engines idle, and scanned the ground. The 3 sets of tracks were still there, heading out from the forest, as if whatever had been following us had maintained its pace until we reached safety. I studied them close enough to see the depth and weight, the rhythm of heavy boots or paws, and realized they were human. Large, heavy, and deliberate. Someone had been walking right behind us in the dark, pacing us for God knows how long, silent except for the snow beneath their feet. We didn't move for several minutes. My brother and I just sat on the sleds, staring at the tracks, trying to understand what had happened. No footprints led to the clearing from any other direction. Whoever, or whatever, had followed us had vanished into the trees without leaving a path, as if they had melted into the night. The forest returned to its quiet, the way it had been before the engines failed, but the weight of it had changed. The snow felt thinner somehow, the trees closer, as if the space between them had shrunk after what we had witnessed. We turned back slowly, retracing our route along the trail, this time alert to every shadow, every sound. The forest was still, oppressive in its silence, but the tracks didn't follow this time. When we returned to the cabin, engines quieting in the snow-packed driveway, we examined the machines. Nothing was wrong with them. The stalls had been mechanical coincidence, random flukes in the cold. There were no scratches on the machines, no sign of interference. Just the tracks, still burned into my memory, proof that we hadn't imagined the pacing in the trees. By morning, the snow had settled, covering the trail in a thin layer of frost. The tracks were still faintly visible, but impossible to follow. We didn't go back out after that night. The machine stayed parked in the shed, covered, and we stayed inside the cabin, the forest outside quiet, untouched, and endlessly patient. I never understood what had followed us. I don't think I ever will. There was nothing supernatural, no explanation beyond someone walking behind us in the dark, silent and careful, unseen but undeniably present. And that was enough. Enough to make the forest feel alive in a way it had never felt before. Enough to make us never take the trails at night again. Enough to leave us both quietly shaken for the rest of the season. The snowmobiles worked perfectly the next day. The forest was calm, but the memory of 3 sets of tracks pacing us through the trees at midnight never left. December 31st, 1998, 10:50 p.m. I drove up the northern Oregon coast in late afternoon. The sky a fading gray over the ocean and cliffs, everything wet with the residue of a day-long drizzle. I wanted to be alone, to feel something different from the usual chaos of New Year's Eve, with its shouting, crowded bars, and forced happiness. The car radio had been off for most of the drive, leaving only the rhythm of the tires on the wet asphalt and the occasional gull circling above the cliffs. When I reached the small access road that led to the beach, the parking lot was empty except for my car, and the wind whipped the bare trees along the edge. I stepped out, the cold biting through my coat, and felt an immediate sense of isolation that I had been craving. The sand was dark and damp, almost black in the absence of any moonlight. The wind tore at my jacket and hair, carrying a sharp salt taste from the sea. The waves crashed with a hollow, relentless force, pulling debris from the shoreline in erratic, uneven patterns. Driftwood, smooth stones, and bits of seaweed rolled and collided with one another. I walked toward the water, boots sinking slightly in the cold, heavy sand, leaving deep impressions that the tide immediately began to smear. I had expected some scattered people, maybe a couple of late-night walkers, but there was no one. Nothing moved except the waves, the occasional piece of driftwood, and the wind that shook the sand across the shore. I settled on a large, partially buried drift log, sitting with my coat pulled tightly around me and watching the ocean. I had brought a thermos of coffee, but I barely touched it, focusing instead on the emptiness. I tried to let my thoughts drift, to stop feeling the pull of anxiety I always got when the world reminded me I was alone at a time when everyone else seemed to be celebrating. The wind tugged at my scarf, making it hard to hear myself think, and the cold seeped into my bones so slowly I almost didn't notice. Then I saw the figure. Far down the beach, maybe 200 yards away, someone was standing just at the water's edge. They were facing the ocean, completely still, and for a long moment I thought they were part of the rocks or a piece of driftwood stacked upright. The wind obscured any details. I could not tell what they were wearing or even their size, only that they were unmoving. I stayed where I was, not wanting to startle them by moving closer or by calling out, and watched. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, and still they did not shift. Their posture was rigid, shoulders squared, head level. The waves were chaotic, violent, rolling in fast, then retreating unevenly, exposing jagged rocks I hadn't noticed before. The tide was unusually low, pulling back farther than I thought it should for the hour, revealing shapes of stones that were slick and sharp in the surf light. Every time a wave crashed and drew back, the figure remained unmoved, as though the ocean itself had no influence over them. I realized my fingers were numb despite my gloves, my coffee long cold, but I could not look away. I felt a weight in my chest, a mixture of worry and fascination, as if the figure represented something I could not yet name. Time stretched. I counted in my head, trying to anchor myself. 10 minutes, 20, 40. The wind howled louder, sand whipping into my face, salt stinging my eyes. I shifted my weight on the log, feeling the damp wood creak beneath me, and the sound of my own breathing became loud and intrusive. Still, the figure remained. Occasionally a gull would scream overhead, wings angled against the wind, and I realized I had not heard any other signs of life. No distant cars, no lights on the access road, nothing but the relentless rhythm of the surf. Closer to midnight, the tide dropped again more abruptly. The water pulled back in a way that revealed the beach in layers I had never seen. Rocks protruded like jagged teeth, and the sand between them was wet and glistening, reflecting the dim gray light of a hidden moon behind clouds. I noticed the figure again, still the same distance away, but the contrast of the exposed rocks made it clearer that the person was standing on a small rise in the sand, their feet untouched by water. The ocean was violent, but somehow they were unaffected, balanced as if nothing in the natural world could alter them. I tried to calculate what they were doing, whether they were someone stranded, someone waiting for a ride, or someone who had simply come to watch the waves. The longer I stared, the more I realized I could not determine anything about them. Height, sex, age, nothing. The wind tore at the sand around me, pulling grit into my hair and coat, but the figure remained perfectly still. I considered walking closer, but the tide was unpredictable, the rocks treacherous, and I did not want to risk it. I stayed where I was, feeling simultaneously frozen and restless. At exactly midnight, the wind gusted in a way that knocked me off balance on the log, and the waves retreated more than I had ever seen. They pulled so far back that the waterline revealed a bed of rocks I had assumed were part of the cliffs, hidden until now. The figure remained in the same place, but I saw something strange. The sand beneath their feet was completely dry. No water had reached them. My mind raced, trying to understand how the waves could retreat so far and leave someone untouched, and I realized it was not supernatural. It was simply the way the currents had pulled, combined with the small rise in the sand that kept them dry. The shoreline itself was irregular, almost like the ocean had carved new shapes in the beach. When I looked again a minute later, the figure was gone. Not walking away, not turning, simply gone. My first thought was that they had moved into the water, but the waves were too rough, and they would have been swept away immediately. The sand was smooth where they had been standing, dry in a way that made sense once I examined the incline. A small dune had created a shadowed rise that I had not noticed, making it impossible for the tide to reach that exact spot. The figure had not disappeared mysteriously. They had simply stepped down the slope behind it, leaving no immediate trace in the darkness, only the sense that they had been there for a long, impossible stretch of time. I stayed on the log, shivering, watching the waves reclaim the exposed rocks, until the first signs of the moon peeked from behind the clouds. The wind calmed slightly, and the roar of the surf became rhythmic again. I understood then that the figure had been someone like me, someone who had come alone to the beach, perhaps to be unseen, to watch the ocean, to wait. New Year's was a night of solitude for them as well. I felt a strange kinship, realizing that the fear and fascination I had experienced was not about the supernatural, but about the sudden intimacy of witnessing someone else's private moment. Eventually, I stood and walked along the sand, boots sinking into the wet surface, toward where the figure had been. There was no sign of anyone now, no footprints except my own. The driftwood I had settled against earlier was partially submerged by a returning wave. I walked back to my car slowly, keeping my eyes on the water, noticing how the waves settled into their familiar rhythm, how the tide began to cover the exposed rocks again, and how the wind softened into a steady breeze. I drove back along the coastal road, headlights cutting through the fog, and felt a sense of completion. The ocean had not harmed anyone, the figure had not disappeared into some impossible void, and the night had not been haunted in any conventional sense. I had simply shared a moment with someone else in the same kind of loneliness I carried, a quiet acknowledgement that solitude could be profound without needing explanation. The beach was empty, the tide had revealed its secrets, and I had witnessed something fleeting but entirely real. It was enough. By the time I reached the highway, a thin layer of frost had begun to form along the edges of the road, and the first distant lights of a town flickered in the fog. I felt the tension in my chest ease. New Year's Eve would come and go for everyone else with noise and fireworks, but for me, it had been a night of observation, endurance, and quiet clarity. The ocean, the empty beach, and the solitary figure had left me with a tangible sense of being present, grounded in reality, and unafraid of the silence that I had sought. I understood then that the emptiness I had chased was not frightening. It was a mirror, reflecting my own need to witness, to be unseen, and to understand. I drove on, leaving the dark coast behind, and for the first time in years, I felt the night had given me something more than fear or anxiety. It had given me perspective. I volunteered to work New Year's at the municipal water treatment plant because I needed the overtime. Everyone else I knew wanted to be somewhere loud, drinking, shouting, celebrating the year turning over. I wanted quiet and money. The plant was nearly empty, except for the skeleton crew maintaining the systems. I clocked in around midnight, the halls fluorescent and sterile, the air heavy with a faint chemical tang that smelled like disinfectant and metal. I walked the familiar corridors, hearing my boots echo on the concrete, the hum of pumps vibrating through the floor beneath me. Everything was the same as it always was, the same machinery, the same monitors blinking in green and red, the same sharp smell of chlorine. I started my rounds, checking pressure gauges, flow meters, the chemical levels in the tanks. Everything was nominal. I kept an eye on the cameras feeding live images from the intake tunnels along the river, which were thick with shadows and condensation at this hour. The river itself was dark and sluggish, flowing steadily under the moonlight I could see through the grates in the ceiling. The intake tunnels were long and cylindrical, lined with concrete, echoing the faint noise of moving water like a constant, low whisper. Around 2:30 a.m., the first alarm sounded. It was faint, a single chime that cut through the mechanical hum of the building. I glanced at the monitors. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary, all levels in the control panels green. Then another alarm, and another in sequence, a slow cascade of alerts that made the hair on my neck prickle. They weren't error codes. The gauges showed real pressure changes in the intake lines. The flow readings flickered briefly, spiking, then dropping back to normal. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the tunnels to see if there was anything physically obstructing the intake. The tunnels were narrow and dark, the concrete slick from condensation. My footsteps echoed in the hollow passage. I could hear the river's current moving somewhere far below, muffled but persistent. I swept the flashlight beam along the walls, the floor, the surface of the water. There was nothing visible, no debris, no branches, no animals. The water looked black and heavy under the beam, swirling slowly. I checked the cameras again. The same emptiness, just the condensation fogging the lens. Then, for a brief instant, one camera froze on a single frame. Against the lens from the inside of the tunnel, pressed in a way that shouldn't have been possible for any object that size, a shape appeared. Dark, blurred, like a shadow but with a form that hinted at limbs, pressed against the glass. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't debris. I blinked. The image disappeared. The alarm stopped at the exact same moment. Pressure readings normalized. Everything returned to green on the monitors. I checked the tunnels again with the flashlight. Nothing. The water was still. The walls were empty. I moved my hands over the cold concrete and ran my fingers along the edge of the grates, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen anything. The silence afterward felt heavier than before, oppressive, like the building had held its breath and was slowly exhaling. I stayed in the control room for the rest of the shift, watching the screens, running repeated diagnostics. Management called the next morning, asking for a report. I described the alarms, the pressure fluctuations, the reading on the intake sensors. They said it was debris, a log or a collection of branches, nothing unusual for the river this time of year. I wasn't convinced. The water didn't look like it carried any debris. There was no log, no bundle of sticks, no trash. Something had been moving against the flow. Something that shouldn't have been able to. The building itself seemed to carry a new weight after that night. The halls felt narrower, the hum of the pumps more insistent, the fluorescent lights harsher. I found myself walking more slowly during my next rounds, running my fingers over the railings, checking the drains and valves with a level of caution I hadn't had before. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every hiss of steam from the pipes sounded deliberate. I spent hours staring at the monitors, watching water move as if it were alive, waiting for the alarms to go off again. They never did, not in the following nights, but I couldn't shake the memory of that shape pressed against the camera lens. 2 weeks later, I quit. The overtime was no longer worth it. The money didn't matter when I couldn't convince myself that what I had seen wasn't real. I left the plant quietly, turning in my keycard and logging out, the building humming behind me like it had been holding a secret I couldn't understand. I told myself the alarms had been glitches, the readings a coincidence, the image a trick of condensation and shadows. I tried, in the days afterward, to forget it. But every time I pictured the intake tunnels, the concrete walls slick with moisture, the black water swirling, the memory returned. That shape pressed against the camera lens. It was real. Something had moved through the tunnels against the flow, slow, deliberate, and untraceable. I never went back. I never told anyone the truth about what I saw, except in fragments, because it didn't make sense. Management never admitted to anything unusual. They said it was routine debris, routine alarms, routine errors. But I know what I saw. I know that in the quietest hours of the year, in a building built to carry and clean water, something had moved against its course, something I couldn't identify. It wasn't a trick of light or shadow. It wasn't human. It wasn't logical. And I wasn't going to spend another minute in that building, waiting for it to appear again. I took the graveyard shift for money, but I left with the memory of something that didn't belong, something that moved in silence against the current, something that reminded me that even the most ordinary places can hold secrets that are impossible to explain. The shift itself was routine. The building was routine. The river flowed as it always had. And yet, for a brief, frozen moment, everything changed. And I was there, awake, alone, and powerless to do anything about it. I haven't returned since. I will never work another graveyard shift. I will never enter a water treatment plant at night. I will never forget the shape pressed against the lens.